The night I watched my father take my mother's life, he screamed while looking straight into my eyes, "You're next." In that moment, with trembling hands, I knew I had only one chance to survive that nightmare. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my dear friends. How wonderful it is to sit here on the porch of my little house and share a piece of my life with you all. My name is Mary Frances Wilson, but everyone here in Millbrook, Alabama knows me simply as Miss Mary. I'm 76 years old now, born and raised in Pineville, a small town in Kentucky, but I've been living here in Millbrook for decades, in this house with blue shutters that faces the most beautiful sunset you could ever imagine. These days, my greatest pleasure is tending to my rose garden and teaching embroidery to the young ladies in town. I have a group of 15 girls who come every Tuesday and Thursday to learn the stitches my grandmother taught me. It brings me such joy to see how excited they get when they finish a handkerchief or napkin with those tiny, perfect stitches. I also make blackberry cordial that I sell at the town farmer's market. Everyone says it's the best in Millbrook, but I think it's because I add a touch of cinnamon that makes all the difference. I started embroidering as a little girl when my grandmother Eliza would sit me down beside her on our porch in Pineville. She had the patience of an angel teaching me every stitch. "Mary," she'd say, "each stitch is like a day in your life. You have to make it carefully, because once you've tied the knot, there's no going back." I only understood the true meaning of those words many years later, when life taught me in the harshest way possible. I'm sitting here in my rocking chair with my little shawl around my shoulders because the September breeze in Millbrook can be tricky, bringing that little chill that gets into old bones. Beside me is my small table with a cup of lemon balm tea I just made. The view from here overlooks my garden, where the roses are starting to bloom after yesterday's light rain. It's a little corner of peace that I built after so much suffering. And you, my dear friends watching me now, tell me in the comments, which town are you watching from? And what time of day did you find this video? Are you holding a hot cup of coffee like me? Or are you lying in bed before sleep? I love knowing where you're from and how you found this old grandma here. If you enjoy my story, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to Grandparents' Tales so you don't miss the next stories I'll share with you. You know, today I want to share a story I've kept in my heart for a long time. It's not easy to talk about, but I feel the time has come to lift this weight from my chest. It's a story about a night that changed my life forever, about losing everything in the blink of an eye and finding strength where I didn't know I had any. About how, sometimes, life puts us in situations where we have only seconds to make decisions that will determine our entire future. I'm going to tell you how, at 12 years old, I saw my life turned upside down in a single night, and how I managed to survive afterward. It's difficult to revisit these memories, but perhaps my story can give strength to someone who's going through difficult times. I remember as if it were yesterday our little house in Pineville, the smell of cornbread that my mother made every morning, and how everything changed so quickly on that stormy night. My childhood in Pineville was simple but filled with affection, at least until that night. I was born in 1949, in a small wooden house with a yard full of fruit trees. My father, Richard Thomas Wilson, worked in the coal mines that were strong in the region at that time. He was a tall man with calloused hands and green eyes that seemed to change color when he got angry. My mother, Elizabeth Ann Wilson, was a seamstress who made dresses for almost all the important families in town. She had long black hair that she always braided and pinned in a bun, and a smile that lit up the whole room. We were a family of 5, me, my parents, and my 2 siblings. George was the oldest, 8 years older than me, already 20 when everything happened. He worked with my father in the mines, waking up early and only returning when the sun had already set. My sister Margaret was 4 years older than me, a young lady of 16 who helped my mother with the sewing and dreamed of marrying the general store owner's son, Tommy. Our house was on a dirt road, Maple Street, a little way from the town center. It was a simple house, but my mother always kept everything very clean and organized. The wooden floor shone from polishing. The curtains were always well washed and ironed. In the yard, we had apple trees, cherry trees, and a huge lemon tree that produced lemons the size of small oranges. We also had a vegetable garden where my mother planted herbs and vegetables, and a chicken coop with about 10 hens that gave us fresh eggs every morning. The routine was always the same. We woke up when the rooster crowed, around 5 in the morning. Mama was already up preparing breakfast with the wood stove already lit, filling the house with the smell of roasted chestnuts she liked to serve in winter and warm cornbread. Daddy and George left for work, Margaret helped Mama with the household chores, and I went to the town school, which was about a 20-minute walk from our house. The school was a small brick building with only 4 rooms. Miss Harriet was my teacher, a lady with thick glasses who had the patience of a saint with the children. It was she who taught me to read and write, and always said I had a special way with words. During recess hours, we played Ring Around the Rosie, hopscotch, and dodgeball. My best friend was Ellen, the pharmacist's daughter, a freckled and cheerful girl who was always making up stories. After school, I would go home to help Mama. While she sewed, bent over the black Singer sewing machine we had in the living room, I washed the lunch dishes, swept the floor, or fed the chickens. When I finished my chores, I liked to sit on the back doorstep and draw with stubs of pencils left over from old notebooks. Sundays were special days. We all went to service at the First Baptist Church in the center of town. Mama would put on her only good dress, a navy blue one with white polka dots, and pin a flower in her hair. Daddy would wear a starched white shirt and a hat that only came off when entering the church. After the service, we sometimes visited Grandma Eliza, who lived on a farm near the Cumberland River, about 2 miles from town. It was Grandma who began teaching me embroidery when I was about 7. She would sit in the rocking chair on the porch, put her glasses on the tip of her nose, and show me each stitch with a patience that only a grandmother has. First, the cross stitch, then the satin stitch. The buttonhole comes last because it's more difficult, she would say. Grandma embroidered the most beautiful trousseaux in Pineville, and young brides-to-be lined up to order tablecloths and sheets with their initials embroidered by her. Life was peaceful, despite the difficulties. Sometimes there wasn't enough money for sugar or for kerosene for the lamp, since electric light only reached the center of town. Daddy worked hard, but the money from the mine wasn't much, and that's when things started to change. Slowly at first, almost without us noticing. When I was about 10, I noticed that Daddy started coming home later from work. He came with a different smell, which only later I came to understand was bourbon. On days when he arrived like this, he barely spoke to us, went straight to bed, and slept until the next day. Mama stayed quiet, eyes downcast, and told us to do the same. "Don't bother your father," she would whisper. "He's tired from work." But with time, that tiredness turned into something else. The first time I saw Daddy yell at Mama was because of a shirt. He said she hadn't ironed it properly, that it was wrinkled in the back. Mama, always so calm, apologized and took the iron to heat on the stove, but it wasn't about the shirt anymore. Daddy started talking about other things, about how she didn't take care of the house properly, about how the money was never enough. George, my brother, tried to intervene. "Dad, the shirt is fine. You're seeing problems where there aren't any." I'll never forget the look Daddy gave him. It was the first time I saw fear in my older brother's eyes. Daddy didn't say anything, just pointed to the door, and George understood it was better to leave. That night, Mama slept in my room with me and Margaret. Things got worse gradually. We discovered that Daddy had lost his job at the mine, but he left every morning pretending he was going to work. In reality, he spent the day at Jimmy's tavern, drinking on credit until he could no longer stand. The money that came into the house was only what Mama earned with her sewing, and it was barely enough for basic food. The fights became more frequent and the screams louder. Mama tried to protect us, sending us to play in the yard or at a neighbor's house when she realized Daddy was coming back in that state. Sometimes in the morning I would see purple marks on her arms, which she tried to hide with long sleeves. She would say she had hit the corner of the table or tripped over the bucket. I was small, but I wasn't foolish. George started coming home less and less. At 20, he was already working at the sawmill on the other side of town and only appeared occasionally, usually when he knew Daddy wasn't around. He would bring a little money for Mama, hidden, and always brought me a candy or a ribbon for my hair. "Take care of Mom," he would tell me before leaving, and I promised I would, even without knowing exactly how to do that. Margaret changed too. From a cheerful girl who hummed while helping Mama, she became a quiet young woman, always with her eyes downcast. The dream of marrying Tommy seemed increasingly distant, since his family, which was one of the most respected in town, began to notice that something wasn't right in our house. And it was on a stormy night, one of those with thunderstorms that make the windows shake, that everything came to a head. I was 12 years old. It was January 1962, I remember, because I had just had my birthday. The heat was suffocating even with the rain. Daddy hadn't shown up at home for 2 days. Mama was worried, not about him, but about what would happen when he returned. We were having dinner, just me, Mama, and Margaret, when we heard the shouting at the gate. It was him, soaked with rain and bourbon, shouting that he was going to end it all, that we were all against him. Mama pushed us to the bedroom, locked the door, and went back to the living room to try to calm Daddy down. Margaret hugged me tightly, and we both huddled behind the bed, hearing the shouting getting louder and louder. That night, the storm outside seemed to reflect what was happening inside our house. The thunder swallowed part of the shouting, but we could still hear the horrible words that Daddy was saying to Mama. Margaret trembled beside me, hands covering her ears. "Pray, Mary," she whispered. "Pray for the Lord to protect Mama." Suddenly, we heard a noise that was neither thunder nor shouting. It was something breaking, something heavy. Then came the silence, more frightening than any shout. Margaret and I looked at each other, our eyes wide in the dark. She signaled for me to stay quiet and went to the door, trying to listen. Nothing. Not even a murmur. "I'm going to see what happened," she said, her voice almost gone. "Don't go," I begged, grabbing her arm. "It's dangerous." But she gently removed my hand. "We need to know if Mama is okay." Margaret unlocked the bedroom door carefully, making no noise. She opened just a crack and peeked. Then she turned to me, her face as pale as wax. "Stay here. Don't come out for anything. Do you understand? For anything." She went out and closed the door behind her. I was left alone in the dark room, hugging my knees, hearing my heart beating so loud it seemed like it was going to come out of my mouth. I counted to 100, then again and again. Margaret wasn't coming back. The silence was total, except for the occasional thunder and the pattering of rain on the roof. I don't know how much time passed until I gathered the courage to leave the room. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. When I finally opened the door, what I saw has never left my memory. no matter how hard I've tried to forget. The living room was partially dark, illuminated only by a lamp that swung on a hook near the window. On the floor, near the overturned dining table, was Mama, motionless. A dark pool was spreading around her. Daddy was kneeling beside her, his hands dirty with that same dark liquid, staring fixedly at what he had done. Margaret was standing in the other corner of the room, holding an iron pan in her hand, seeming to be in a state of shock. It was then that Daddy saw me. His eyes, which always changed color when he was angry, seemed to have no color at that moment. They were just two empty holes staring directly into my soul. "You saw what your sister did?" he said, his voice strangely calm. "She tried to stop me from disciplining your mother. Now look what happened." He got up slowly, staggering a little. The smell of bourbon mixed with another metallic odor invaded my nostrils. "And you, Mary? Are you going to try to stop me too?" He took a step in my direction. "Your mother never respected me, always thinking she's better than me, with that air of superiority. Another step, and you're just like her." It was at that moment that he screamed those words that were branded in my memory. "You're next!" My feet seemed glued to the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Besides, what I saw that night I don't have the courage to tell, but those who stay until the end of this account of my life I'll tell in secret. Daddy took another step in my direction, extending his dirty hands. That's when Margaret reacted. "Run, Mary! Run!" Her scream broke my state of paralysis. I turned and ran to the kitchen, hearing Daddy's heavy steps behind me. I bumped into the table, knocking things to the floor. In the darkness, my hands groped for something, anything that could help me. I felt the wooden handle of the knife that Mama used to cut meat. Daddy appeared in the kitchen door, a dark silhouette against the weak light of the living room lamp. He came toward me with outstretched arms. I closed my eyes and gripped the knife with all my strength, extending it forward. I felt a thud and then a weight on me, pushing me against the wood stove. I opened my eyes and saw Daddy staring at me from close up, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked down to where the knife had disappeared between us. Then he staggered backward, hit against the wall, and slid to the floor. "Mary," he said, his voice now weak. "What did you—" I dropped the knife as if it were red hot and backed away to the other side of the kitchen, trembling uncontrollably. My clothes were wet, sticking to my body. I looked at my hands in the dim light and saw that they were dark, stained. Margaret appeared in the kitchen door. She looked at Daddy on the floor, then at me. She didn't say anything, just came to me and hugged me. We stayed like that for a while, two girls hugging in the dark kitchen while the storm continued outside. "We need to get out of here," Margaret finally whispered in my ear. "George, we have to go to his house." "But, Mama," my voice came out broken by sobs. Margaret held my face between her hands, forcing me to look at her. "Mama is gone now, Mary, and you were just defending yourself, understand? Just defending yourself." She took me to the bedroom, helped me change clothes, and put some pieces in a makeshift bundle with a sheet. The rain had diminished, but it was still falling steadily. We left through the back door, two shadows in the night of Pineville. George's house was on the other side of town, near the sawmill where he worked. It was a wooden shack with only one room, but to us that night, it seemed like a safe palace. He wasn't home when we arrived, wet to the bone and trembling with cold and fear. Margaret broke the back window, and we entered. She lit a lamp she found near the stove and made me sit in the only chair that was there. Then she wrapped my shoulders with an old blanket. "George will be here soon," she said, trying to sound confident. He'll know what to do. I didn't respond. I had the impression that I would never be able to speak again. My throat seemed closed by an impossible knot to untie. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, no matter how hard I tried to control them. George arrived almost an hour later. He came in shaking the rainwater off his coat and stopped when he saw us there. One look at Margaret, and he understood that something terrible had happened. "Where's Mama?" was the first thing he asked. Margaret shook her head, her eyes full of tears. "Daddy." She couldn't finish. "And him?" Margaret looked at me, then back at George. Mary defended herself. George came to me and knelt down, holding my trembling hands in his. "Look at me, Mary." I obeyed, raising my eyes to my brother's face. "You didn't do anything wrong. Understand? Nothing. It was he who started all this. You were just trying to protect yourself." That night, the three of us slept together in George's narrow bed. Or rather, Margaret and I lay down. George sat in the chair, watching over our sleep, although I doubt any of us really slept. In the morning, George went out. He said he was going to fix things. Margaret and I stayed in the shack, not saying a word, just waiting. She tried to make me eat some cornmeal mush that was left in the pot, but I couldn't swallow anything. George returned a few hours later, his face grimmer than I had ever seen. He talked quietly with Margaret in the corner of the shack. I pretended I wasn't listening, but I caught snippets of the conversation. "Sheriff, accident, drunk fell, nobody's going to investigate much. Mr. Henderson will help. Money for us to leave." Mr. Henderson was the owner of the sawmill, a respected man in town. George had earned his trust with his hard work. Later, I found out it was he who gave money for us to buy train tickets and start a new life far away. 3 days later, when the bodies of Mama and Daddy had already been buried, I didn't go to the funeral. Margaret forbade me. The three of us were at the station, waiting for the 6 o'clock morning train. We were going to Louisville, where a distant cousin of Mama's lived. It was the first step of our escape from Pineville and the memories of that terrible night. While we waited for the train, I looked one last time at the little town where I was born, the lights of the houses beginning to turn on in the early morning. I felt a tightness in my chest, thinking of everything I was leaving behind. The house where I grew up, the school where I studied, the friends I would never see again, Grandma Eliza who would be left without understanding our sudden disappearance. But I knew we had no choice. Pineville now held memories that none of us could face. The train to Louisville swayed on the tracks as I watched the landscape pass by the window. My body was there, but my mind was still trapped in that dark kitchen in Pineville. Margaret sat beside me, holding my hand tightly, as if afraid I might disappear if she let go. George was sitting across from us, his tired face and watchful eyes, always vigilant. I didn't speak a word during the entire journey. I couldn't. It was as if my voice had been trapped on that night, along with the innocence of the girl I had been. Margaret and George respected my silence, only exchanging worried looks from time to time. Louisville was a big and noisy city compared to Pineville. The streets were wider, there were more cars, more people, more of everything. Mama's cousin, Mrs. Ruth, received us with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. She was a thin woman with gray hair and a severe face who hadn't seen Mama in more than 20 years. George told her a modified version of the events, that our parents had died in an accident and that we needed a place to stay until we got established. "I don't have much space," she said, looking at the small 2-bedroom apartment where she had lived alone since her husband had died. "But you can stay for a while." That "a while" ended up being only 3 months. Mrs. Ruth wasn't a bad person, but her solitary widow's life didn't adapt well to the sudden presence of 3 young people. George soon found work in a furniture factory, thanks to the experience he had at the sawmill. Margaret got a job as a clerk in a fabric store. I, with my 12 years just completed, was enrolled in the municipal school, but I rarely managed to pay attention in class. My mind was always far away, reliving that night. People noticed my silence, of course. The teachers asked Margaret what was wrong with me. The classmates looked at me as if I were a freak, a girl who doesn't speak, who doesn't smile, who jumps startled when someone touches her shoulder. The whispers followed me down the hallways. She's mute. Something happened to her. They say she saw her parents die. Gradually, the words began to come back, but not in the normal way. I began to have terrible nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night, calling for Mama or begging Daddy not to do that. Margaret would come running to hug me, while Mrs. Ruth complained that she couldn't sleep with all that screaming. It was after one of these episodes when Mrs. Ruth suggested that perhaps I needed a special place for disturbed children, that George decided we needed to move on. He had already saved some money from his work at the factory, and Margaret also had her savings. "We're going to Cincinnati," George announced one night, after Mrs. Ruth had gone to bed. "It's big, nobody knows us, and there are more opportunities." We left the following week, thanking Mrs. Ruth for her hospitality, even though she seemed more relieved than sad to see us go. On the train to Cincinnati, I looked for the last time at the streets of Louisville. I had spent only 3 months there, but each day had seemed like an eternity. Cincinnati was a concrete monster that both scared and fascinated me at the same time. I had never seen so many buildings, so many cars, so many hurried people. We settled in a cheap boarding house in the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood, where many migrants like us were trying to restart their lives. The owner of the boarding house, Mrs. Gladys, was a talkative woman from Georgia who seemed to have a sixth sense for detecting when someone carried secrets. "You're running from something, aren't you?" she asked a few days after our arrival. George tried to deny it, but she just shook her head. "Everyone who comes here is running from something, my son. The important thing is not to bring problems to my boarding house." George found work in a construction materials warehouse. Margaret was hired as a helper in a clothing factory, thanks to the sewing skills she had learned from Mama. And I, now almost 13, should have gone back to school, but I couldn't. The fear of being among people, of being observed, of being questioned, was too great. Instead, I stayed at the boarding house during the day, helping Mrs. Gladys with cleaning and cooking. She didn't ask questions about my past, just taught me how to clean the rooms, how to prepare beans just right, how to make strong coffee the way the boarders liked it. "This girl shouldn't be working. She should be studying," she commented to Margaret once when she thought I couldn't hear. "There's something broken inside her. You can see it in her eyes." At night, when we retired to the small room we shared, Margaret would hug me and talk about the future. How one day we would have our own house, how she would open a sewing studio, how George would find a good girl to marry. We never talked about the past, about Pineville, about our parents. It was as if we had made a silent pact to bury those memories. But they didn't stay buried. They emerged in my nightmares, in the panic reactions when I heard a raised male voice, in my always watchful gaze at doors and windows, always looking for escape routes. Margaret and George also carried their scars. Margaret never mentioned the dream of getting married again. George started drinking more than he should on weekends, arriving late at the boarding house with the lost look that reminded me too much of Daddy. It was on one of these nights, almost a year after our arrival in Cincinnati, that everything changed again. George arrived drunk, stumbling through the hallways of the boarding house. Margaret tried to calm him down, take him to the room before Mrs. Gladys woke up and kicked us out. But he resisted, shouting disconnected things about our parents, about Pineville, about how he was tired of running. "You don't understand," he yelled, while Margaret tried to stifle his voice. "They'll find us. The police will discover what happened." I was paralyzed in the corner of the room, seeing my brother transformed into a version of Daddy. Even knowing it was the alcohol talking, even knowing he would never hurt me, I felt the same fear as on that night. When he turned in my direction, gesticulating violently, I had a panic attack. I ran out of the room, out of the boarding house, into the dark streets of Cincinnati. I ran without direction, just fleeing from Daddy's ghost that had momentarily possessed my brother. Margaret came after me, shouting my name, but I was blind and deaf with terror. I only stopped when I had no more breath, in some alley where I huddled behind cardboard boxes. Margaret found me there, trembling like a leaf. She knelt beside me, hugged me, and cried with me. "We can't continue like this," she said, when we finally managed to calm down. "George is losing himself. You're becoming more and more closed off. We need help, Mary." The next day, while George slept to cure his hangover, Margaret took me to a church in the center of the city. It wasn't Catholic like the one we attended in Pineville, but a Protestant one, with a simple sign in front: Redemption Baptist Church. Margaret had heard about it through a colleague at the factory. The pastor, a middle-aged man named Jeremiah, received us in his small office. Margaret told our story, not all the dark details, but enough for him to understand that we carried a burden too heavy for our young ages. "God doesn't give burdens we cannot carry," he said, holding our hands, "but he also sends angels to help along the way." That visit changed the course of our lives. Pastor Jeremiah's congregation maintained work with families in difficulty. They helped us find a small apartment to rent, seek treatment for George, and even enroll me in private classes with a retired teacher who was part of the church. The trauma didn't disappear overnight. The nightmares continued, as did the panic attacks. But, for the first time since that night in Pineville, I felt that we weren't running anymore. We had found people who accepted us without asking questions about our past, who offered us not only material help, but also that spiritual comfort that I didn't know I so desperately needed. Recovery was a slow and painful process. There were good days when I could smile a little, pay attention to the lessons from Mrs. Abigail, and even help in the church kitchen. But there were also bad days, when the memories returned with such force that I could barely get out of bed. It was on one of those bad days, almost 2 years after our arrival in Cincinnati, that everything came to a critical point. I was 14 years old, no longer a child, but neither was I a normal teenager. While other girls my age thought about parties and boys, I was still fighting the ghosts of the past. That morning, Margaret had left early for work. She was now head seamstress at the factory, thanks to her talent with needles. George had been sober for almost a year, regularly attending the meetings of a support group at the church, and worked as a supervisor at the warehouse. I should have gone to Mrs. Abigail's house for my classes, but I couldn't get out of bed. A particularly vivid nightmare had left me trembling and cold sweating. In the dream, I was back in that kitchen in Pineville, but this time, when Daddy advanced toward me, the knife wasn't there. His hands closed around my neck, and I could feel life being squeezed out of my body, while I saw Mama's face watching me from a corner, pale and accusatory, as if saying, "Why didn't you save me?" I woke up screaming, alone in our small apartment. I lay for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to move. It was then that I noticed something strange, a smell. The smell of bourbon mixed with sweat that was so characteristic of Daddy in the last times. It wasn't possible. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks, but the smell seemed so real. I got up in panic, looking for the source of that odor. I went to the small living room, then to the kitchen. Nothing. The apartment was empty. But then, when passing by George's room, I saw it. An empty bottle thrown under the bed, barely hidden. My brother, who had promised never to drink again, who seemed to be recovering so well, had brought that poison into our house. Something inside me broke. If not even George, who was strong, who had protected us, could escape Daddy's shadow, what hope was there for me? I felt a huge anger grow in my chest, not directed at my brother, but at the life that had been imposed on us, at the ghosts that wouldn't leave us in peace. I grabbed the bottle and hurled it against the wall with all the strength I had. The glass shattered, spreading shards across the floor. The noise seemed to release something in me. I started to scream, to cry, to break everything that was within my reach. I took a chair and smashed it against the table. I tore the curtains, turned over the sofa, broke the plates in the kitchen. When there was nothing left to destroy, I fell to my knees in the middle of that devastation, sobbing like I had never done before. That's how Margaret found me when she returned early from work, worried because Mrs. Abigail had called the factory to report my absence. "My God, Mary! What happened?" She ran to me, stepping on shards of glass, ignoring the state of the apartment. "I can't take it anymore," I managed to say between sobs. "I can't live like this anymore, with fear, with these memories. I don't want to dream about them every night. I don't want to see Mama's face accusing me. I don't want to smell Daddy. I want it all to end." Margaret hugged me tightly, rocking me as she did when I was little. "Mary, my little sister, you're not to blame for anything that happened. You just defended yourself. If you hadn't done what you did, he would have killed you too, just like he did Mama." "But what if—" I hesitated, finally verbalizing the thought that had tormented me for years. "What if I'm like him? His blood runs in me, Margaret. What if one day I—" "Never," she interrupted me, holding my face between her hands, forcing me to look into her eyes. "You will never be like him. You have Mama's heart, Mary. You're gentle, you're good. What you did that night wasn't out of malice. It was for survival." It was then that I confessed my deepest fear, one that I had never been able to put into words before. "I miss them, Margaret. Even after everything. I miss how it was before, when Daddy was still good, when Mama sang while she sewed." "How can I miss something that ended in such a horrible way?" Margaret cried with me, and I realized it was the first time we were really talking openly about that night, about our parents, about the contradictory feelings we carried. We realized we had spent 2 years trying to pretend that the past didn't exist, as if we could simply erase that part of our lives and move on. When George arrived from work and saw the state of the apartment, we expected him to be furious. Instead, he joined us on the floor, in the midst of the rubble of our attempt to build a new life, and also cried. "I thought I was protecting you, hiding my problems," he confessed. "But I was just repeating what Daddy did, keeping everything inside until it exploded." That night, the 3 of us sat in the semi-destroyed kitchen, and for the first time since we fled Pineville, we talked honestly about everything. About the childhood we had, about how Daddy changed, about Mama trying to protect us until the end, about how each of us carried a guilt that didn't belong to us. "We can't stay in Cincinnati," George said after we had talked a lot. "There are too many memories here too too many ghosts. We need a new beginning, a real one, where we can face the past instead of trying to bury it. Margaret agreed. I know a lady from the church who has a sister in Nashville. She said it's a good city, with work opportunities, not as big and scary as Cincinnati. That night, lying in my bed among the rubble of the apartment, I had a different dream. I dreamed of Mama, not pale and accusatory as in the nightmares, but smiling, sitting on the porch of our house in Pineville with sewing in her lap. In the dream, she looked at me and said, "It's time for you to live, my daughter. Not just survive, but really live." I woke up with a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't exactly peace. It was something more like determination. That day marked a turning point in my life. The day I decided I wouldn't forever be the frightened girl from Pineville, that I would find a way to transform that pain into something different. The following week, we began planning our move to Nashville. We didn't have much, and what we had was largely destroyed thanks to my outburst. But we had each other, and for the first time in years, we had hope. Pastor Jeremiah helped us make contact with a sister church in Nashville. We sold the little that remained and bought bus tickets. It was April 1965, almost 3.5 years since that fateful night in Pineville. I was now almost 16 years old, no longer a child, but also hadn't had the chance to really be a teenager. It was time to start over, to try to build a life that was more than just a constant escape. Nashville welcomed us with a milder climate than Cincinnati. It wasn't a small town like Pineville, but it also didn't have the frantic pace of the larger city. It seemed a good middle ground for us, a place where we could adapt without feeling swallowed up. The local church, through Pastor Jeremiah's contacts, helped us find a small house to rent in the Belmont neighborhood, away from downtown. It was a simple place, with only 2 bedrooms, but it seemed like a palace compared to the apartment we had in Cincinnati. Most importantly, it was a place without memories, without ghosts, where we could really try a fresh start. George soon found work at a bus company as a mechanic. The salary was better than in Cincinnati, and he seemed more determined than ever to stay sober. Margaret also didn't take long to find a position, this time in a small atelier that made wedding dresses. Her talent with needles impressed the owner of the studio so much that in a short time she was already in charge of the most delicate embroidery. As for me, at 16, it was time to return to regular school. It was difficult at first. I had lost many years, was behind compared to other students my age. But the private classes with Mrs. Abigail in Cincinnati had given me a good foundation, and I was determined to make up for lost time. Hillsborough High School accepted me into a special program for students who needed to accelerate their studies. The principal, Mrs. Thompson, was a serious but compassionate woman who didn't ask many questions about our past when Margaret explained that we had lost our parents and gone through difficulties. "The important thing is that you're here now and will do everything possible to help this young lady build her future," she said, and those words gave me a comfort I didn't expect to feel. At school, I met the art teacher, Mrs. Emily, who noticed my interest in handcrafts. When I mentioned that my grandmother had taught me to embroider when I was little, her eyes lit up. "Embroidery is an art that's being lost," she said. "Today's young women prefer other activities. If you have that knowledge, you should preserve it and develop it." She lent me books about traditional embroidery from different regions of America and the world. I began to practice on weekends, recovering the memories of Grandma Eliza's teachings. It was strange how that simple act of passing the needle through the fabric brought me a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. As if, with each stitch, I was sewing not just the fabric, but also the broken parts inside me. Margaret noticed my renewed interest and brought fabric scraps from the atelier for me to practice. In a short time I began to create small pieces, embroidered handkerchiefs, dish towels with floral motifs, table runners. They weren't perfect, but each one represented a small step in my recovery. One day, Mrs. Emily invited me to participate in a craft fair that would take place at the school. I hesitated at first, frightened by the idea of exposing my work, of exposing myself. But she insisted, saying she had organized a special space for me and some other students who did handcrafts. "It's important to celebrate what we know how to do well, Mary," she said, "especially when that knowledge comes from previous generations." The fair took place on a sunny Saturday in September 1965. Margaret and George were there, proud, encouraging me. I set up a small table with the works I had made in the last few months. To my surprise, several people stopped to look, praised the stitches, asked if the pieces were for sale. They weren't. I hadn't thought of that, but the experience planted a seed in my head. It was at this fair that I met Mrs. Eleanor, a lady of about 70, who wore a colorful scarf on her head and had hands deformed by arthritis. She approached my table, examined each piece with critical eyes, and finally said, "You have the gift, girl. Who taught you?" "My grandmother started teaching me," I answered timidly. "But she was left behind when we moved." Mrs. Eleanor nodded, as if she understood much more than I had said. "I have a group of embroiderers that meets at my house every Wednesday. Older women mostly, trying to keep the tradition alive. You should come." I accepted the invitation more out of politeness than conviction. I didn't imagine that simple visit would change the course of my life. Mrs. Eleanor's house was on a quiet street in the Belmead neighborhood. It was an old construction, with a well-kept garden in front and a spacious back porch where 6 or 7 ladies gathered around a large table, each with her embroidery hoop. At first, they looked at me with curiosity. I was by far the youngest there. But Mrs. Eleanor introduced me with enthusiasm. "This is Mary, the young lady I told you about. She has blessed hands for embroidery." I sat shyly in the place they indicated and took out of my bag the small hoop with the work I was doing. A tray cloth with a pattern of violets that I had copied from one of the books lent by Mrs. Emily. The ladies came closer to see, making technical comments about the stitches, the choice of colors, the tension of the thread. "It's not perfect," I murmured, embarrassed under the scrutiny of so many experienced eyes. "Perfection is for machines, my child," replied Mrs. Beatrice, a lady with hair as white as snow. "The charm of handmade embroidery is precisely in the small imperfections that tell the story of who made it." That afternoon was a revelation. I spent hours listening to those women's stories, learning techniques that weren't in any book, secrets passed from generation to generation. When I returned home, I felt strangely light, as if I had found a piece of myself that was lost. "How was it?" Margaret asked, noticing something different in my countenance. It was like I was with Grandma Eliza again," I answered, and my voice broke as I said it. It was the first time in years that I could talk about my grandmother without feeling that acute pain in my chest. I began to regularly attend the meetings at Mrs. Eleanor's house. The ladies took me under their wings, each teaching me her specialty. Mrs. Beatrice was an expert in cross-stitch. Mrs. Dorothy mastered cutwork embroidery. Mrs. Lillian did a drawn thread work that looked like bobbin lace. And Mrs. Eleanor herself was a master of shading embroidery with her perfect gradients. More than techniques, they taught me about life. All had their own stories of pain and overcoming. Mrs. Eleanor had lost her husband and 2 sons in a train accident. Mrs. Beatrice had raised 6 children alone after being abandoned by her husband. Mrs. Dorothy had survived a cancer that had left visible marks on her body. And all found in embroidery not just a form of artistic expression, but also a therapy, a way to transform pain into beauty. In October of that same year, Mrs. Eleanor made me a proposal that would change my life. "We're receiving more orders than we can handle. Would you like to work with us? We would pay per piece." It was an opportunity I couldn't refuse. Besides continuing my accelerated studies in the morning, I began dedicating afternoons to embroidery. Margaret was radiant with the news. "See? The gift that Grandma Eliza passed to you is opening doors for you." It was a period of intense transformation. As I dedicated myself to embroidery, I felt that each stitch helped heal an internal wound. The painful memories didn't disappear, but they seemed less acute, as if they were being softened, just like the colors of a fabric exposed to the sun for a long time. At school, I also progressed rapidly. The teachers noticed my dedication, my thirst for learning. In 1967, at 18, I managed to finish high school. It was a huge victory for someone who had been out of school for so long. George and Margaret were at the graduation, applauding louder than everyone when I received my diploma. My brother, now 26, had established himself at the bus company, being promoted to chief mechanic. Margaret, at 22, was respected at the atelier where she worked, creating the most elaborate embroidery for wedding dresses of Nashville's high society. We had managed to build a stable and dignified life. It wasn't luxurious, but it was ours, achieved with honest work and determination. More importantly, it was a life without secrets between us. We had learned to talk openly about the past, to recognize the triggers that could take us back to that terrible night, to support each other in difficult moments. The most significant turning point, however, happened in 1968 when Mrs. Eleanor announced that she was moving to Millbrook, Alabama, to live with her only daughter who had married a doctor from the region. "And what will happen to our group?" I asked, worried about the possibility of losing that safe haven that had become so important to me. "That's why I want to talk to you, Mary," she answered, holding my hands in hers, knotted by arthritis. "You're young, have talent and passion for this work. The other ladies are already in advanced age, some with fragile health. Someone needs to continue what we started, preserve this knowledge, pass it on." I didn't immediately understand what she was proposing. I thought she wanted me to take over leadership of the group in Nashville, but Mrs. Eleanor had something more daring in mind. "Come with me to Millbrook," she said. "My daughter has a large house, with space to set up a studio. You could live with us for a while, until you establish yourself. Millbrook is a small town, but it's growing. There's no one there with your talent for embroidery, and the more affluent families in the region value this type of work for wedding and christening trousseaux." The proposal completely surprised me. Move to the other side of the country? Leave George and Margaret, my only family? It was frightening to think about it. But at the same time, I felt an inexplicable excitement with the idea. It would be, perhaps, the opportunity to really build something of my own, to define who Mary Wilson was beyond the tragedy that had marked my life. Here I am, on this porch in Millbrook, Alabama, looking at my rose garden while the sun begins to set. 57 years have passed since that unexpected proposal from Mrs. Eleanor. I was just a young woman of 19, scared by the idea of crossing the country, but at the same time thirsty to build my own path. The decision to come to Millbrook wasn't easy. George and Margaret, at first, were devastated by the possibility of separation. We were more than siblings. We were survivors of the same storm, companions on a painful journey. But they also understood that I needed this opportunity. "You deserve to have your own life, Mary," Margaret told me, holding my hands. "You can't forever remain in the shadow of what happened in Pineville." And so, in September 1968, I boarded a bus bound for Montgomery, where Mrs. Eleanor was waiting for me to go together to Millbrook. The journey was long and tiring, 2 days on the road, crossing states, seeing the landscape change completely. Millbrook welcomed me with its scorching sun and its welcoming people. Mrs. Eleanor's daughter's house, Dr. Susan, was a spacious construction on the main street of town. Her husband, Dr. Robert, was one of the few doctors in the region, respected by all. They welcomed me as family, giving me a comfortable room and space to set up a small studio at the back of the house. The first years were of adaptation and learning. The different accent, the local expressions, the heat that seemed to melt the bones. Everything was new to me. But it was also liberating. Here, nobody knew my past. Nobody looked at me with pity or curiosity. I was just the girl from the north who does embroidery, brought by the respected Mrs. Eleanor. I started slowly, doing small jobs for family acquaintances. A baby layette here, an altar cloth for the church there. My reputation grew gradually. Mrs. Eleanor, always generous, introduced me to everyone as the best embroiderer I've ever known, an exaggeration that I silently thanked her for. In 1972, when I turned 23, I rented a small house near the central square and officially opened my own studio. It was a simple but welcoming space, with a window where I displayed some pieces and a room at the back where I gave classes to the young ladies of the town who wanted to learn the art of embroidery. It was at this time that I met William, an English teacher who had come from Birmingham to teach at the local school. He entered my studio looking for a gift for his mother, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. He returned a week later to pick up the order and invited me for coffee. Our courtship was tranquil, unhurried. At 26 in 1975, we married in a simple ceremony at Millbrook First Baptist Church. William was the first person to whom I told the whole truth about my past. Sitting at Lake Jordan on a starry night, I let the words flow as I had never done before. I talked about Pineville, about my parents, about that terrible night, about the escape with my siblings. He listened in silence, holding my hand, and when I finished, he just hugged me and said, "Thank you for trusting me with your story. Now let's write a new one together." Our marriage lasted 40 wonderful years until William passed away in 2015, victim of a heart attack. We had 2 daughters, Sarah, who today is a doctor in Montgomery, and Emily, who followed her father's footsteps and is an English teacher at the university. I have 5 grandchildren who are the light of my life: Matthew and Lily, Sarah's children, and Thomas, Claire, and Michael, Emily's children. My embroidery studio grew over the years, becoming a reference in the entire state. I trained dozens of embroiderers, many of whom opened their own businesses afterward. In 2005, I published a book with techniques and stories of Southern embroidery, a way to preserve this knowledge for future generations. The launch was one of the happiest days of my life, especially because Margaret came from Nashville especially for the occasion. Yes, I maintained contact with my siblings throughout all these decades. George remained in Nashville, married a colleague from church, and had 3 children. Unfortunately, he left us in 2010 after a long battle against cancer. Margaret never married, dedicating her life to the wedding dress atelier that she eventually bought from her former employer. Today, at 80, she still supervises the work, although she has passed the administration to her niece. I officially retired 10 years ago, when I turn 66, although I still do some special work and give embroidery classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays to a group of 15 girls, as I mentioned at the beginning. Embroidery was never just a job for me. It was therapy. It was healing. It was the way I found to transform pain into beauty. My little house here in Millbrook is my refuge. The walls are decorated with embroidered pictures that tell my journey. In the living room, the most precious of them, a portrait of my mother, Elizabeth, which I embroidered from memory years after coming here. It's as if, with each stitch, I could keep alive the gentle woman she was, separate from the tragedy that took her. Mornings are dedicated to the garden, afternoons to embroidery classes, and evenings to reading, a habit that William encouraged me to cultivate. It's a simple, quiet life, but rich in meaning. When I look back at the long road that brought me here, I feel gratitude for having survived, for having found strength to transform trauma into growth. That frightened girl from Pineville could never have imagined the full life I would build in Millbrook, a life of love, art, and service to others. My dear friends who are watching me, I want to end this story with a request from the bottom of my heart. If you know someone who is going through difficult situations, through violence at home, extend your hand. Sometimes all a person needs is to know that they're not alone, that there is a way out, that there is a tomorrow after the storm. If you yourself are living in an environment of fear and aggression, know that you deserve more. You deserve peace, respect, and security. Seek help. In each city, there are people and organizations ready to support those in vulnerable situations. No matter where you are, there is always a path to freedom. I learned that age doesn't define our strength, but rather our capacity to start again each day. When I left Pineville that early morning, I thought my life had ended before it even began. How could a 12-year-old girl, marked by such a great tragedy, find a future? But life has a curious way of opening doors when we think all paths are closed. My wrinkles are maps of survival. Each one tells a story of pain overcome. I carry the marks of time and the experiences that shaped who I am today. And I can say, from the height of my 76 years, that pain can be transformed into something beautiful, just as a simple piece of cloth is transformed into a work of art through embroidery. Life taught me that even in the deepest darkness, our inner light never goes out. Even in the darkest moments in Cincinnati, when I thought I would never recover, there was a spark of hope that refused to die. It was this small light that guided me here. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it teaches us to live with them and still smile. The painful memories don't completely disappear. Even today, occasionally, I wake up from a nightmare with an accelerated heart. But I learned not to allow the past to steal the joy of the present. My story isn't about what they did to me, but about how I chose to respond. I could have become bitter, distrustful, closed to the world. Instead, I chose to open my heart, share my art, build a family, be a safe haven for others. Age has given me the wisdom to understand that our story doesn't end in the painful chapters. There is always a new page to be written, a new dawn to be lived, a new chance to find happiness. Now, to finish on a perfect note, I want to tell a secret to those of you who really stayed listening to me until here. When my father killed my mother, he didn't just kill her, he used her. Well, you know what I mean. This is very difficult for me to talk about, so if you understood what I told up to here and were moved, I kindly ask you to subscribe to Grandparents' Tales, like the video, and most importantly, comment the word memories. All who comment this, I'll put in my nighttime prayer, because I feel a lot of memories from my mother, who protected me every day and